Welcome to the Fast Cat Podcast. I'm your host, Frank Overton. Some call me the Big Cat, and we have Coach Andrew Jeanette in the house. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you, Frank?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be talking about training load with you today.
Yeah, me as well. Me as well.
Awesome. What is your training load every right now? If I may ask, if that's too personal.
Yeah, you can. So it's interesting. And this is gonna we're gonna talk on all this a lot more in a bit here, but I'm sort of at the end of my base season now and kind of transitioning to race mode. And
Hmm.
so what I would like to have my training load at is probably 90 to 100. I think that's kind of appropriate for the level that I'm racing at, doing sort
Hmm.
of the elite level road stuff here in the US. But unfortunately, my training load is only 70 because I've been busy and it's a lot of work. And the only good news about that is that I'm an old dog and I can get away with a little bit lower of a training load using tactics and strategy, and that's something that I can talk to you about if
Racecraft.
if you're one of my athletes,
Yeah.
how we can maximize our performance for a given training load, but the goal would be to be a bit higher. Yeah, what
Yeah.
about you?
My training load is in the 50s, I think. Sometimes I try not to check because it's also lower than what I would like it to be. Um, but listeners, in the past, when I was the fittest, maybe I was your age, Andrew, I was up in like the 120s, and then I could reduce that to like the low 100s for peak performance. In
Hmm.
my master's days, back in loyal listeners remember when I was training for the Crusher and the Tusher. As an older athlete, you can't really achieve as high a training loads. About 100, I found myself in my 40s that I could get up to, and then reduce that by about 10 and race in between 85 and 95 and be like in really, really good form. Coach Jake texted me a picture of his training load just yesterday because we've been doing those sweet spot Saturday rides where the OTS values are north of 200, sometimes 300. Because Jake did like a century on there the other day, and you could see these like spikes regular every 7 days. But his CTL, I mean, his training load has gone from like 0 to 66 since the beginning of the year. He literally
Wow,
came off the couch January 1st, and oops, I just bopped my microphone. And he's got a great build going. So
that's
anyway,
awesome.
but yeah, I would like to be up in the. It's early for me, and so I have easily 2 or 3 more months to keep building, and
Hmm.
that's my plan. I'd like to achieve about a 75 by Memorial Day.
Yeah, and so one thing that I'll kind of clarify is that I also want to be at that higher training load, and I'm pretty committed to getting up to the 90s. But between now and then, I don't necessarily expect to be racing my best because, again, we'll talk about this more in a moment. But you're probably not going to be racing your best when you have a positive ramp rate. So, in other words, when you're building and you're gaining fitness, y- there will be moments where I'll feel fitter and I'll feel better, but um, I might feel in 3 months from now, I might coast back down to a 70 in race really, really well. But
Hmm.
that's only coming off of that higher training load and sort of tapering into the race season, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So we'll talk much more about this, but yeah, it's an interesting topic, and there's a lot of nuance to it. And the one thing that I hope that all of our listeners will take away from this conversation is that the number is important, but there's a lot of considerations with that. It's not just biggest number wins, right? At least not on race day. So,
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so listeners, what Andrew is talking about is training load, and it's not the thought that more is better. More is better to a certain point with some caveats, and then the composition of your training of how you got there. But then there's a few more considerations we want to share with you in this podcast today. But I want to back up for a second and mention why training load is important. And it's a power based metric that it's been around for about 20 years. It's originally called CTL in the original performance manager chart. We call it load or training load. It's calculated from your OTS, which is your daily power based amount of work you've done, duration times intensity. And training load is simply calculated from a rolling 42-day average of your OTS values from your daily training. And so you your current training load is an amalgamation of those 42 days. And generally, we've known for a long time, even before power meters, the more you train, the more fit you're going to be. And now you have these numbers and metrics to assign just how fit you are. Like in the early days, that when you roll up to the group ride, maybe this time of year, and you say, yeah, how's your training going? And people would be like, yeah, I've been riding a little bit, or I've been riding a lot. Now you can just say, well, my training load is this. Most people don't do that because you don't want to be a nerd, but that's the answer. It's like, my training load is this, my training load is that. And it really helps us as coaches and you as athletes to know, should you keep building, or should you try a different training strategy? And this gets into like pyramidal style training, or when you should switch to polarized and back off. So we'll get into that, but that's why training load is important. And to continue on, the more you train, the faster and the more fitter you can be. But what we also see is the higher your threshold power is. There's a correlation between your training load and your threshold power to a point. And we're going to talk about that linear relationship, and also up to that point and where you deviate from that.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Let's do a couple of announcements real quick before we do. So, everyone, there is a new group ride in town. It's on Wednesdays with me. We're calling it the Early Bird Watts ride. It's 6:30 a.m. Mountain Time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific. Sorry, West Coasters. But it's going to be an hour, and it's going to take this group ride format where we're going to start hard, but not like race hard. We're going to settle into medium, and we're going to finish hard. So it's a good 1 hour workout without mind numbing intervals. We'll get the Discord channel going for banner and motivation, but we'll be done by 7:30. You can shower, you can be at your desk ready to get to work by 8 a.m. All you need to do, everyone's welcome. All you listeners, love to meet some of you. Go to the Zwift companion app, find the Fast Cat Coaching Club, join it. It's free, and then you can RSVP there, and we'll see you. We'll see you virtually in Zwift, and hear you on the Discord if you choose to get in. The Discord link is in the Fast Cat Club. So it's just an evolution of the Sweet Spot Saturday rides we've been doing, which have been quite good, and also good for ye old training load uh, with the high values. So that's announcement number one. The announcement number two: juniors ride free. That's going strong, and we also have a couple of Steamboat coaching packages left. If anyone wants to race Steamboat with a guaranteed entry and then roll that into an annual coaching package, hit us up, and we'd love to work with you.
Sweet.
All right, Andrew, let's talk about training load.
Yes, let's do it.
Yeah, awesome. So, where would you like to start? Let me ask you this. As a coach, when you work with someone, what is your strategy with training load, and how you use that to prescribe training for your athletes?
hmm Yeah, so this is kind of a very distilled or boiled down framework for thinking about training load. So, one of my goals as a coach is to help athletes arrive at basically their highest possible training load without cooking them. And so I would kind of think of this as like the maximal recoverable load. And so like your lifestyle and how much time you have available, how much you can recover is going to set the stage for what that number is. And so my goal is to identify what is that number based on those factors, and how do we get there. So kind of backing up a little bit further again, I want to start off by saying how much load you can generate primarily is going to be limited by how much time you have to ride, or your volume, which is just the sum total of your weekly training hours, right? So The reason why that is because there's a limit to how much intensity you can do. So if you could only ride 1 hour every day, the maximum OTS you could generate on a given day is 100. We need rest days. So that leaves you at like a, maybe that would be like a CTL of 80, but that's not advisable, right? Like that's not good. We need to have the right recipe of training. We have to do both, some volume of zone 2 riding, which is generally easy and doesn't come with as much fatigue. And then we also have to do the intensity, and we want to blend those two together well. And that blend depends on the time of the year, what your goals are, what your life is like. And there's always going to be a little bit of trade off between volume and intensity. So weaving those two together in the appropriate way is really really important. So that's kind of like the high level of how I think about that, and then also how we get there.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that, Frank?
Yeah, yeah. I think that to share with the listeners, to throw some numbers out there of training
Hmm.
load and everything. So 20 years ago, I modeled out Christian Vanderveld's Tour de France training load from the 2005 tour, and he was exiting the Pyrenees and the Alps stages, approximately 165 training load. And then what you would see is during the transition stages or the flat or the sprinting non-GC stages, the TSSs would be lower. His CTL would actually go decrease, but then it would go back up when he was doing 350, you know, day stages in a row, like 3 days in a row. So that's like the max, like, that's what World Tour riders are doing. I think World Tour riders are now riding more nowadays than they were back then. I haven't modeled out anyone's training load data recently from the World Tour, but I would expect them to be in the 150s, 160s. I would say, the trend for gravel racers to be doing these 30, 40-hour weeks, you're going to see training loads in the 175s. And as we talked about with, I think as Elliot and Sierra talked about, you can cook yourself doing that, and it's quite
For sure.
risky, uh, especially if you're not really on top of your training. But for us mere mortals, as Andrew and I were talking about at the beginning of the pod, like me in my 50s, getting up to a 90 would be extraordinary. If I can just get up to 75 by Memorial Day, in the context of how much time I have to train, which is about 8 hours a week, that's how you have to think about it. And
Right.
you have to take how much time a week you have to train, apply that to your training load, then you're manipulating intensity, to push it even higher, and that kind of arrives at like your peak CTL that you can achieve.
Yeah, yeah. And to kind of speak to that more and use myself as an example, yeah, when I had more time available, I was younger, I was recovering better. 120 was totally achievable, totally appropriate, and I would have been flying. That's if I tried to get to 120 CTL now, or I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, training load. Um, I don't think I would ride well. I think I would ride really bad because I'd be
Yeah.
under recovered. Right,
Mm-hmm.
I don't have time to be doing that. So what I would have to do to get there is I'd have to try and shoehorn in a lot of additional intensity. Right, so my average weekly intensity factor would be too high. That would come
Mm-hmm.
with too much fatigue, and I would just be tired, right? So I would be past that point of what I'm calling like the maximal recoverable load. But for a younger rider, or somebody that just has a lot of time on their hands, yeah, they might ride amazing at 120 training
Yeah.
load, right? So
Yeah.
it totally depends. And so again, just to kind of summarize, um, if you want to maximize your training load, you need to reduce your stress, right? Which you can measure, how stressed you are, looking at something like HRV, right? And that's why we lean on that metric. You
Mm-hmm.
can also use your wearables to measure how much you're sleeping. You're going to need to sleep a lot if you want to have
Yes.
this higher than you've ever had before training load, because those two factors are going to mean that you can recover better, you can handle more load. And then, one of the big things that we've, I think, talked about on this podcast before is the fueling revolution, is what I'm calling it.
Yeah.
And when I say the fueling revolution, what I'm referring to is uh, mostly just getting in more carbohydrates, right? So there's when we're talking about cooking yourself, what I'm really talking about is overtraining, or
Mhm.
the earlier stages of that are called overreaching, and those things can be mitigated by proper fueling. So if you're trying to reach your highest ever training load, you need to fuel for that work, and you need to eat more than if you were trying to fuel for a lower training load. And so, if you can sleep well, keep stress low, fuel really well, in other words, just be really dialed,
Mhm.
we as coaches, or if you're using the app, can get you to a higher training load than you've been before, and you're going to perform better, which is
That's right.
awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the ingredients need to be there, and you have to have the right recipe. You have to have that right blend of volume and intensity
Yeah.
to get to that number. You can't just chase the number, because in a vacuum, it's not that meaningful.
Yeah. 100%. And so for all the masters out there over 50, all is not lost. I want to give a shout out to Steven. He nearly won the Steamboat 100 last summer. He can ride on Zwift a lot, no problem. Doesn't mind it. We are already at 130, in March 4th. No problem. Just 2 3 hour ride. So if you can handle the trainer, Zwift is a great way to build training load. If you don't mind doing 2 3 hour rides, he does 12 15 hour weeks, no problem. He's got his sleep dialed, his nutrition dialed, everything. So the point is, all is not lost. If you're super time crunched and you can't handle the trainer, you're going to need to think in terms of lower training load volumes. But it can be done. Yeah,
Well, in a couple of tips that I'll throw out there for the time crunch athletes of the world is, you know, one weekend day, try and do a really long ride, right?
yeah,
Like that's going to make up the biggest percentage of your weekly volume. If you can ride 4 to 5 hours, at least one of the weekend days, even if you only have an hour during the week, you're at 10 11 hours, super easy, right?
yep, yeah,
So that's a tip. Another tip that you can follow is, I mean, it's not preferred, but it's the way some people have to do it. You can train twice a day, right? I mean, that's
2 days.
definitely a thing.
Yeah,
So maybe you only have an hour before work, but maybe you also have an hour after work. Doing 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening is probably less good than just doing 2 hours straight, but it's better than just doing 1 hour, is the way that I
that's
would think
right.
about it. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of ways to skin the cat with this, and
uh-huh.
another option, and this goes into what Frank and I were talking about earlier with, um, like having been at a higher training load is still a positive thing, right? Like you don't necessarily need to be at that peak training load to race your best. Is like try and find a training camp, right? Like
Yeah,
I know it can be a tough compromise with the family, but if you have like a spring break period and you can ride a little bit extra, you can kind of negotiate to bring your bike to Hawaii or wherever. Like that's a big
right.
opportunity. And just because you can't sustain that higher volume year round doesn't mean that it wasn't still helpful,
Yeah,
come race season. But that does have to be appropriately timed, right? Like
hmm,
if you are racing Memorial Day and then you're going to Tulsa next weekend, or whatever it is, you can't do a training camp between those two. That doesn't make any sense.
no,
So
do
you
it
have to
beforehand.
have a smart periodization, and there's a time of the year where we want you to have your highest training load,
Hmm.
and then that's, I want to hear your thoughts on this, but that's generally sort of like end of base, or kind of what we describe as switching from base to race,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
um, because we're going to need more freshness when we switch to the higher intensity intervals, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's not compatible necessarily with like this really high volume. So we have to make concessions to accommodate that higher intensity work, because you need to be fresher to do your best watts.
Yeah. Yeah. So uh, to unpack that a little bit, so a strategically timed training camp or even a long weekend, you can use that to really put the finishing touches, the cherry on top of your your K of your base. And so say your CTL is or training load is 75, 80. You got that training camp. I'll work with athletes like to time that training camp to push it up another 5 to 10. And then after that, we're going to take a rest week, and then we're going to switch from base to race and focus on intervals. And when timed properly, a training camp 2 weeks before your first day event can be incredible because you can just enter right into a 2 week taper and just be on the form of your life. In the olden days, Andrew, the Norba National opener was in Big Bear, California. It was usually second weekend of May, and conveniently, the Tour of the Gila was 2 weeks before that. So the mountain bikers, we would go down to the Gila, do a 5 day stage race, ramp up our. We didn't even know what training load was back then because we didn't have power meters, but we would do it, and then we would go home, rest for about 10 days, go to Big Bear, and then that would we'd be on like peak form for the first A race of the year, and that still applies today. Now we just have numbers to apply to that. But you can also do, if you can negotiate like doing two medium long rides on a Saturday, Sunday, or maybe you got like a long weekend, like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or a Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Do like plan out a 3 day like volume block, and that can be a great way to boost up training load. But like you said, like the vacation where you can maybe ride 2 3 hours a day every day as opposed to just 1 hour. That's another strategy. And like the point you made about the long ride was is really good. Even if if you only have an hour a day to train, like during the work week, doing those 4 to 6 hour rides once a week on like a Saturday or a Sunday is incredible training, especially if you're doing these long gravel races, and your training load will incrementally go up, and yeah, you'll be able to hit those training load numbers that you want.
Yeah, another thing I'll throw out there, and this is kind of a shout out to us or shout out to you, Frank, is one of the best tools that I think I have as a coach to increasing training load is the sorts of training that we do during base. So,
Mm,
sweet
yeah.
spot in particular, and I promise everyone out there this is not like a selfless plug or something like that.
Yeah.
It's just true, and other coaches use it as well at other companies. Sweet spot is fantastic because you can generate a really high OTS for your rides using it, and
Mm,
you don't. This goes back to the cooking yourself thing. You generally won't cook yourself as long as your FTP is set correctly. Sweet spot is just a phenomenal tool because you can ride at a generally pretty high intensity, but the fatigue incurred is not that bad.
that's
And
right.
that is why, at the end of our base season or switching from base to race, we can reach these peak CTLs, or I'm sorry, peak training loads, is because we're doing a lot of this sort of middle intensity sort of stuff, which
Hmm.
just generates tons and tons of OTS,
That's
right?
right.
And
Yeah.
you're not, if you've done it correctly and you followed a good periodization, you should be hungry to really press on the pedal super hard after this. You don't want to get to this training load and be cooked, right? You want to be hungry. You want to feel fast, and you want to feel like you're at maybe 90% of the way there,
Yeah.
right? I think that
Yeah.
was the number that you put to it earlier. Um, yeah, and then you kind of back off a little bit and add in those intervals and really sharpen up.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and it's just a beautiful thing.
It really is a beautiful thing. The way, first of all, we'll talk about what cooking is in a second, but when you're building, when you're sweet spotting, when you're really ramping up, a great way to tell that you're just to validate with yourself that you're not cooking yourself, when you take a recovery day or a recovery 2 days or a block of a rest week, you should feel better at the that first day back of training. Your legs feel fresh, they feel powerful, you have good sensations. If that is occurring, if you're getting like crazy tired, you take rest and then you feel good back on the bike, you're on the right track. On the other hand, if you take the recovery and you don't feel good coming back, you still feel fatigued, your legs are wood, not great sensations, you're cooking yourself. And that you just simple as that. You just need more recovery, or you need to ride less hard or less long. And that's so
Right.
you can use those little sensations as you build along to not cook yourself and micro adjust your training.
Right. Yeah. And it's a big part of what I do as a coach is help kind of diagnose
Yeah.
bad sensations days. And then I use your feedback and I use kind of a dialogue to figure out what that is and then make adjustments. And yes, to speak to what you just said, Frank, or to kind of clarify that a little bit for our listeners, um, it goes back to things I've already just said on this podcast. The first of which is like you need to have your FTP set correctly, because
Yep.
if you try and ride sweet spot too hard and you're actually just doing threshold at this point in the year,
Yeah.
you're gonna be in trouble. Like you're gonna feel really bad, and and then the other piece again, just to kind of beat a dead horse here, is the fueling component, right? Like if you don't eat during your rides and then you don't have carbohydrates after that ride, after that hard sweet spot session,
Hmm.
yeah, like nothing is happening on the
Yeah.
recovery front. And then you
Yeah.
take your Friday rest day, you get to Saturday, yeah, and you feel the same as you did at the end of your sweet spot session, which is because you didn't recover.
Right.
So it's yeah, I mean it's yeah, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, you could also be doing the wrong type of training, right? You know, if it's like, you know, January and you just did a 40-hour week on the trainer, like, yeah, that was too much. That was too
Too
much,
much.
too soon.
That's group ride
You
hero.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, you insist on doing, you know, the group ride all winter. That's a bad idea.
Yeah.
You know, and later in the year, and this is kind of coming full circle. We don't just do base training. We don't like follow this pyramidal approach in that first, you know, let's say third of the year, just to have a big number at the end of it. We also do it because it prepares us for the higher intensity work,
Yeah.
right? And we'll get into kind of the physiology of what I'm saying here in a moment, but um, your general preparation period or your base period can almost be thought of as preparing to train, like you're training to train to some extent. And
Yeah.
it
Each
does,
block prepares you for the next block.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all needs to be put in an important sequence. And, you know, we have seen people doing higher intensity earlier in the year. And Frank, you've talked about microdosing VO2s.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I think you have a training article for that. You even did a podcast about it, but
Sprinkle it in.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, we're able to. We've kind of figured out as a community that we can get away with a little bit more intensity earlier in the years now, and again that goes back, I think, to the fueling revolution. You know, just because we can stave off overtraining a little bit better than we used to be able to because we're recovering better, fueling better, those sorts of things. But
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah.
mean you can just do whatever you want in January. There still has to be smart periodization, a strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So everyone, what Andrew's also talking about is not doing too much and not doing too much volume. But with regards to the recovery, it's like a wise man once said, there's no such thing as too much training. There's just too much, like, not enough recovery. So there's no such thing as overtraining. There's under recovering. And so when you're training well, you want to pay attention to your sleep, your HRV, and your nutrition. And you got to hit it at both ends. You got to train just enough. You got to recover just enough. And really, this is the genesis of the optimize screen, where we take in the OTS from your training. We quantify your recovery through your sleep and your heart rate variability. We quantify how much training you've done, how much recovery you've achieved. We balance that out and we give you a red or green score on a per day basis. We've connected that all to an AI coach that analyzes your sleep and your HRV and really analyzes your recovery and says you're good to go with the prescribed training, or hey, you're under recovered, you're in the red, you need to consider doing less today. And it really helps masters athletes, even pro athletes, fine tune their training on a per day basis so they don't cook themselves. So, like, a great example of cooking yourself is being in the red and not adjusting your training for multiple days in a row. Sometimes you want to do that, like a stage race or a training camp, because you know you have future recovery coming to you. But doing that on a per day basis, just weeks and weeks and weeks, that's how you dig yourself a hole that kind of can sabotage your whole entire season.
Yeah, totally. And also I should say, like, and you've already spoke to this with your comment about, people over 50, you can still do everything right. You can have a ton of time to train, you can have your fueling dialed, your sleep, your stress, and there's still a limit to the the peak training load that you would want to achieve. I mean,
Yeah,
there's just some like immutable physiologic factors here, right? And there's different people have different capacity for recovery, and some of that is just natural.
yeah,
And even your phenotype can even define like what levers to pull in your training to achieve the best training load outcome. And so, yeah, you need to figure that out a little bit. So, like, I guess one example could be like people that are more slow twitch dominant athletes tend to
mhm,
tolerate a little bit more volume better.
yeah,
Whereas for me, I'm more of a fast twitch dominant athlete. I need to be careful with that because in my case, I could cook myself doing a ton of volume. If I
yeah,
tried to do one of those, 30-hour all zone 2 trainer weeks,
hmm,
I'd be doomed. My season would be totally ruined. It's like not a good idea.
yeah,
But that's after years of uncovering my physiology and what I can handle and historic numbers of where I've performed best. So it's not necessarily super straightforward in terms of like do all these things and then you can just train to infinity. It doesn't work that way. So
yeah. You know, Sebastian Weber talks a lot about this with the specificity of sprinter training versus like a GC training. And, it's pretty well established that sprinters should do less volume and have lower training loads in order to preserve their sprint power. And if they
hmm
do too much too soon, it sucks out their sprint power. So then they're no good for like the Tour de France versus the GC rider. They don't need to sprint. They can really concentrate on volume and threshold like endurance and durability efforts.
I love that point, Frank. And something that we see, this is like a really well documented phenomena. It's probably getting better than it used to be, but if you look at the winning sprint numbers from the second half or the towards the end of the tour, they
Hmm.
stink. They're like, yeah, it's awesome. It's kind of fun to see because it makes you feel better about your own sprint numbers. But you
Yeah.
know, first stage of the tour, it might be a 1700-watt sprint that wins. By
Hmm.
the end of the tour, it's like a 1200-watt sprint that wins
Yeah.
because those guys are achieving crazy training loads over the course of those 3 weeks and doing
Hmm.
all that volume. It's not good for your sprint.
No.
Nobody thinks it is.
Yeah.
And so there are some necessary trade-offs, right? And then I guess this comes down to, yeah, the previous point of what's your phenotype defines a little bit how you should train, but then also like what are your goals and what are your limiters,
Yeah.
right? Because if you need to sprint extremely well, like if you're like a, I don't know, like a sprint type track rider, like, yeah, you actually want a lower training load,
Yeah. It's
right?
less important.
It's less important. But for like a gravel racer or a road racer, it's different, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I mean, it's just specificity of training, and training load certainly complies with that. So, gravel racer need to concentrate on really high training loads, peak training loads. But you, as a criterium and cyclocross specialist, it's not as important, and therefore, I mean, it also goes to specificity of training dictates your training load, and so you're not out there doing 30-hour weeks. You can concentrate on really high quality workouts and sessions that accentuate and improve your sprint and anaerobic power. That's going to be maybe 10 to 15-hour weeks, and but that is what puts you on the start line with the best
right.
possible performance. So training load is specific to the event you're kind of training, and all the masters will raise their hand, say, well, good, I'm training for a criterium, and therefore I don't need to worry about it as much. And you're right. And but if you're doing gravel or fondos or long road races, even time trials, you really need to pay attention to peak CTL training loads that you need to achieve.
Well, and then just to kind of flesh out that Sebastian Weber point even a little bit more, it's not my sprint going away isn't for nothing, right? I'll probably have a higher FTP though. right? If I do that
Yeah.
training,
Yeah.
yeah, sure, my strength comes down, but if I'm racing gravel and fondos, that is a worthwhile trade-off,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I think this kind of actually brings us to our next point pretty elegantly, which is the relationship of training load to FTP, or just kind of different physiological, um, things. And so, yeah, what's your experience with the correlation, let's say, between training load and FTP?
Yeah, yeah, this kind of also goes to like not all OTS is created equal and not all training loads are created equal. And so the way that I think about it, and I'll use our 16 weeks of sweet spot plan as an example because that's going to get a lot of athletes 80 to 90% towards their peak threshold power. And what we mean is you're not doing just base. So sweet spot, the 16 weeks of sweet spots, 4 mesocycles, 3 weeks on, 1 week off. The first mesocycle is very introductory, sweet spot tempo zone 2, rest week. Then you work in some more sweet spot and progression. Then in build 3, you're microdosing the VO2 work with the crisscross and the over unders recovery week, and then now you're sprinkling in the 3 4 5 minute VO2 max progression. So now you're combining long rides with intensity to achieve higher OTSs, to achieve higher training loads, and you're going to be like hella fast when you come out of there. But there's more gains to be made, and this is where you where we coined the phrase switching from base to race. So you stop trying to build, and say if you achieved a training load of 90, you take that rest week, you let it float down 85, 82, 70, and then now your style of training shifts from pyramidal with the sweet spot to polarized. And now you're taking more rest days, your rods are shorter, but the wattages that you're doing in your workouts is higher. VO2 max workouts, anaerobic capacity, zone 6, threshold work if that's specific to your event. When you combine that work with the sweet spot build that you've just done, now you're going to get to 100% of your threshold potential, and it's really great. So think of it like that. You don't want to just do a sweet spot style training all year round. You want to do both types. You want to do intervals and base, and you combine the two together, and that's your best self.
Yeah, and there's a lot of physiologic basis to what you're saying here, and if our interested if excuse me, if our listeners are interested, and you'll indulge me, I'll go down that rabbit hole.
Oh
um
yes, yes.
yeah, so there is a limit to how much your threshold will respond to threshold type work. So I'm putting sweet spot and tempo in that category. Just all the pyramidal stuff, that middle
Yep,
intensity.
yep.
Um, you can't just keep doing it forever and just expect your threshold to just keep going up indefinitely.
It will
It's
not.
sort of obvious that that wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Just even from thinking about it, without like a real scientific understanding. But what's happening there is that at a certain point, you're reducing what's called your fractional utilization. So your threshold's coming up, but your VO2 max probably isn't really moving that much. And
Hmm.
so there becomes a point where the two numbers can never converge, right? There's always some what's called fractional utilization, which is what percentage of your VO2 max is your threshold. And when you get up to like 85 or 90%, your VO2 max has to go up for your threshold to keep going up. And so Tim Cusick, he was one of the educators for WKO, um, use this analogy. I'm sure many people have actually, of like at a certain point you have to raise the roof, right? So
Yep.
like when we're doing kind of all of this base training, we're kind of building from the bottom, and then there comes a point where yeah, we need to make more headroom for your FTP to come up, and that
Hmm.
happens when we do that VO2 max work.
Yep.
So that's fantastic. But I will also say, just to kind of illustrate the importance of doing the volume as well, is that there are two sides to the VO2 max equation, right? So when we think about VO2 max, from a scientific perspective, we talk about what's called the Fick equation, and it's basically your peripheral adaptations multiplied times your central adaptations. So the central component is basically like cardiac output, like how much blood your heart can pump. That's one side. The other side is the peripheral side, which is your muscle's ability to extract and utilize oxygen. And so we
Mhm.
need to improve both, right, to have the highest possible VO2 max. And usually that higher VO2 max is also going to come with more threshold. And the way that we address the peripheral side is from all that volume, all that base riding. That's all kind of increasing um, mitochondrial density and content. And then, we do the VO2 max work, and that's going to improve stuff like mitochondrial function and cardiac output, right? So then we have both sides. So we're addressing all of your physiology if you follow this correct periodization. And there's a lot of ways to skin the cat, but you do ultimately need to have both. You can't just do volume. You can't just do intensity. I think that's
Yeah.
the biggest point that I'm driving home here. Um, and just to kind of back up what I'm saying here, and we can kind of link this in the show notes. I just wanted to mention one paper I read. It's not particularly new. I think it's 2014, but it was a meta-analysis by David Bishop. David Bishop is an Australian researcher. He's probably the foremost expert in mitochondria, and the paper was really all about how to optimize your training to maximize mitochondrial adaptations. And what he found is that volume drives. There's like a perfect correlation between volume and citrate synthase activity. Citrate synthase activity being sort of the gold standard measure for mitochondrial biogenesis, and so that's a marker of that improving, that piece of your physiology improving, and that's not correlated with intensity. It's
Mhm.
basically just the more riding you do, the better that's going to be. But the important caveat is that unless you do the high intensity stuff as well, your mitochondrial function isn't going to be high. And so this is kind of fun, and this is a like a throwback to the old school kind of coaching philosophies. Um, there was once this idea, and I'm sure you'll remember this, Frank, that if you did too high of intensity, your mitochondria would like explode. Like
Yes.
they would be damaged. and,
Mhm.
and so it turns out that is true. It's true, but it's a good thing. So what happens is that when you do that really high intensity, it can damage mitochondria, but we get this phenomenon called mitophagy, which is where it's similar to autophagy, which is just basically like cellular turnover. And so the poorly functioning damaged mitochondria are replaced with newer, better, and even bigger, better mitochondria. So whole point is, yeah, both are really important. There's a time for each.
Yes. Yeah. It's a recipe, y'all, and you're putting, two ingredients in the right proportion together for your best performance. And if you just do, to even a simpler analogy, if you just do zone 2 training alone, man, you're going to get your doors blown off when the race goes fast or the group ride goes up the hill. But at the same time, if you just do all intensity training, when you do a longer event, you're going to get tired sooner and you won't have any endurance. And so, what Andrew's really talking about is putting the two together.
Yeah, yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't. So we've kind of focused on FTP in this part of the discussion, but a couple of other benefits I want to mention from having that higher training load are your ability to recover, like between efforts, like within
Mhm.
a session or a race, is going to
Oh
be
yeah.
higher, and your ability to recover between sessions is actually also going to be higher. So at
Hmm.
that higher training load, if you've arrived there correctly, then you're going to have greater fatigue resistance, like in general. I don't mean fatigue resistance like within a race, but you're going to get that. You're actually going to get that too. So fatigue resistance in both senses. So
Hmm.
like you're going to be able to do better watts later in the race, but you're also going to be able to handle more and more intense training. Better lactate clearance is like can be a big limiter for a lot of people, and so
Hmm.
that's going to go up. So you can think about like over under style efforts that you might do out there, like really stochastic efforts. Your
Hmm.
ability to like generate a ton of lactate and then clear it and get back to baseline is going to be higher. that all happens in the mitochondria. So yeah, it's the benefits are like it's all of them, and you
Yeah.
need all of these things, right?
Mhm.
And so yeah, with I think our coaching, we try and address the full picture, right?
That's right. I mean, one of the things that athletes report, especially like the gravel racers, when you do get them on a higher volume, higher training load than they've achieved before, now all of a sudden, whereas before they would really start getting fatigued in that third and the fourth hour, now they're not getting fatigued until the fifth or the sixth hour. And it just increases your endurance. It's a very simple term, but you could also describe it as stamina and durability, which is the more modern, you know, metric thrown around nowadays. But having a higher training load just means you've ridden more. You've done, hopefully, you've probably achieved or done more long rides to get that higher training load, and you're able to handle longer races as a result.
Totally. Yeah, and it's funny, like, I actually have some kind of benchmark sensations in my mind associated with different training loads,
Mm.
right? So, if I'm at, like, a training load of, let's say, 70, which is what I'm at now, I have, like, a couple of big matches that I can burn within a
Mhm.
race,
Yeah.
right? Like, I can do the midpoint sprint, and then 30 minutes later, maybe I can recover and do a good sprint in the very end. When I'm
Mhm.
at a training load of, like, 100 plus,
Yeah.
even if my FTP weren't higher, which it probably also is, man, I could cover 30 attacks in a row. And it's just you have so much more margin to play with.
That's right.
And this goes back to that whole original point of, you know, when you have a lower training load, you got to be really savvy. You
Mhm.
have very few matches to burn. You got to be really smart. You got to know how to
Yeah.
recover out there on the course.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that stinks because if anything goes wrong or not according to your plan, you don't get the result.
You have
But
like one match to strike
yeah, yeah, you
sometimes.
have limited chances,
Yeah.
and that's hard because a lot of times that's not enough, right?
Yeah.
You need more matches than that to kind of cover your bases, and so yeah, that's a big reason why I'm kind of hunting for that higher training load is so that I have some more margin out there, right?
Yeah.
I have 20 matches, got a bigger match book,
Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we as coaches, we do try to get athletes to achieve higher training loads so that they do have more matches because we know that gives them a greater chance to achieve the results they want. And then if vice versa, if they do have a lower training load, that influences the way we coach them on maybe their tactics for the race. Like
Hmm.
when you have a higher training load, it's like, hey, why don't you go for the breakaway? If you don't make it, no problem. You can do the late race attack and still go hard, yada yada. If your training load is low, it's like, okay, let's sit in the field all day, and you got a pretty good sprint, so let's try to leverage that. Don't do anything until then.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, one could even say, and this is sort of like an amalgam of another old saying, your FTP sort of determines the level of race that you can do, and then your training load determines your strategy,
That's right.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. That's really good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sweet.
So yeah, everyone, it's March 4th. You got time to work on your training load. Sweet spot is a great way, to keep building it. Let's talk about some techniques of that, um, th- if we have time, because because you mentioned it earlier and I didn't get a chance to come back to it. But so obviously you got your structured training and you got your volume and your hours per week. One of the techniques that we use, so it's called, there's two types. It's called the OTS ride, and I prescribe it in multiples of 25. So you got a 125, 150, 175, all the way up to like 300, 350 for like that epic gravel simulation day. And really it's just like the amount of work you're going to do, and you're going to try to sweet spot as much as your legs will let you. You're going to get tired, then you're going to keep chugging along because that's like how a gravel race is. That's a great way to build training load. You pop off a 350, and if your training load is like 55 and you do a 350, I don't know that mathematical calculation, but it's going to go up to like 60 or 61. And if you recover and you do good training during the week and you do another one of those rides, it's going to go from like 60 to 65 like that in like 2 weeks. You will get to a certain point where now there's an advanced technique that goes above and beyond this. Now this goes by riding longer, riding harder, and you add in intensity to this. Now this is what I call the Amex ride, Andrew. Now, long I'm going to date myself, but the in the 70s there was American Express, and their mantra, the advertising slogan was "Don't leave home without it." You remember that?
I do.
Oh, okay. All right. You're older than we thought. So American Express, don't leave home without it. But what we say for the Amex ride is don't come home without it. And it's an all zones ride. Now you're riding zones 1 through 6. You're riding aggressively. And the reason why is your training load is higher. To your point, like it's how you can, attack your training day. So now you're mingling sweet spot in with VO2, with anaerobic, great to do on group rides or really good simulation rides, all zones. And it's the same concept. If you have an Amex 250 ride, same concept as sweet spot. You want to achieve 250, but with the Amex ride, it's like just keep hitting it, keep riding long until you get that 250, and then you're good for your training that day. Oftentimes those rides can be shorter because you've ridden at a higher intensity.
Hmm.
So we don't really prescribe a duration to those. It's more about the work you do.
Right, and that is only appropriate once you've built up to that. I
That's
think
correct.
is the proviso. And
Yeah,
so if you're following the plans in the CoachCat app, yeah, you don't get those on week one of 16 weeks of sweet spot. You
that's
need to
only in
build
the
up a lot
fourth
of capacity.
mesocycle. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
you have to build capacity to do that. And to Frank's point, right? If you're at an extremely low training load, if you're at like 30, yeah, you can't handle that. You can't recover from that. It just doesn't make any sense. And so
mhm,
there's this beautiful effect where like the fitter you are, the more you can handle, right?
yeah,
And then it becomes really easy to raise your training load. So
yeah,
yeah, it's every step of the way you need to be really pretty on it. And then the other thing that I've kind of just mentioned in passing here is ramp rate. And so that's not a metric that people in the CoachCat app need to be concerned about because it's already built into the plans, right? Like
mhm,
we plan these correctly such that you don't ramp up too quickly. But that's it's exactly what we were just talking about, right? Where um, you need to build on the previous phase,
mhm.
and you can't ramp up too quickly. So if you came to me now and you said, "Hey, I have a race on Memorial Day weekend," and I'm at zero now. What's the highest training load I could achieve? Yeah, it's not that high. So,
Yeah,
that's where you need to maybe pick a race further down the road because there's just a minimum. We've talked about there being like a minimum amount of volume to achieve certain training loads. There's also a minimum amount of time,
that's right.
in weeks and months. So,
Yeah, yeah. If you came to me with a off the couch Memorial Day goal, I would have you sweet spot like parts 2 and 3 for March and April. But then the thing is, this is just what we've been talking about, listeners. You don't want to just do that. You got to mix the intensity to get ready for that race. So you'd switch from base to race around May 1st, do the criterium, like say as a criterium, very popular on Memorial Day. Switch over, do low volume criterium anaerobic work, and then you're getting the best of both worlds in that limited. It's like your 12-week plan to your Memorial Day criterium race. Now, if you were doing a gravel race on Memorial Day, I would again probably sweet spots part 2 and 3, 4 weeks each, and then get into that gravel plan, get into those gravel simulation rides. That's
hmm
the super important part. If you're doing the 4, 5, and 6 hour rides on your long ride day, that combined with the sweet spot work is going to net you the best physiology for a Memorial Day race.
definitely. Sweet.
What else should we talk about, Andrew, with regards to training load and the physiology of it?
Um, yeah, I mean, the only last thing that I'll throw out there for our listeners is that chasing the numbers is bad, right? And this goes back to a lot of the pitfalls that we've talked about already, which are ignoring ramp rates, ignoring a periodization, And lastly, like not communicating with your coach or not paying attention to the metrics with
Yeah.
respect to when you need a rest.
Yeah.
Because if you just endlessly chase the numbers and you're always trying to push that number higher, yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. So just remember that like your best performance isn't just achieved by blindly chasing higher OTS rides and the highest training load you can achieve.
Yeah. Don't go
You
out and
need
do
to,
a 450 OTS ride and think that
yeah,
that's good.
no,
Yeah.
yeah,
The point I would make to that, which I wholeheartedly agree, if you don't want to like try to figure this out, get on a plan. So the 16 weeks of sweet spot plan has all this already thought out for you. All you really need to do is try to follow the plan as best as you can. It's got the amount of rest you should do. It's got when you should take rest weeks. It's got the progression figured out. Um, we got it also tell you like when to switch over to. Hey, all right. So the Andrew's laptop just died. Anyway, we were kind of at the end of the podcast. Anyway, maybe he'll hop back on here soon when he plugs it in. But so yeah, hold on just a second, everyone. If you would like a training solution that maximizes your training load without having to think about it or plan ahead or worry if you're cooking yourself, we've built that for you. We've figured out the progression, how much sweet spot to do, when to sprinkle in the micro dosed VO2s, when to do VO2s, when to do the OTS rides, when to do the Amex rides. It's all part of the 16-week of sweet spot plan. In terms of training load, if you are over 40 and you only have 4 to 8 hours a week to train, you can expect to achieve training loads in the 60s, mid 60s, 65. That'll be great. You can amend that. You can, do a training camp or a long weekend or just ramp up your volume on your own. If you choose the 8 to 12, which is our most common per week hour basis for athletes, we call that the intermediate level. It's really suitable for anyone. It just comes down to how much time do you have to train, if you have 8 to 12, and then if you can recover from that. Now, if you're like over 60, over 70, and you can't recover from 8 to 12 hours a week, that's okay. I would just say bump down to the basic level, 4 to 8. Now, if you're young and fun and you can ride more than 8 to 12 hours a week, like 12 to 15, the advanced level is going to be primo for you. You're going to achieve OTSs in the mid 80s, maybe mid 90s if you really push it. And it's a great plan. And that's approximately 12 to 15 hours a week. And, to Andrew's point, just following the plan is not enough. You've got to recover and you've got to really pay attention to your nutrition, because if you just go do the volume and you're getting poor sleep and you're not recovering and you're not eating well, you're going to leave watts on the table. You're going to cook yourself. The problem is it's a slow cook, and you don't know you've cooked yourself until you know
right.
you you get like 8 weeks down the line. I mean, you can tell you're cooking yourself if you ride too hard like 2 3 days in a row. That's a fast cook, and it's easy to remedy with some rest days. But if you're not eating, you're not recovering, slow cook train to like not good, performance town. So anyway, that's kind of like how we think about the sweet spot. But then what we say is don't just stop there. Switch from base to race, do intervals. And you heard us sprinkle in pyramidal and polarized. And so the best, combined together has been shown to work the best. Interestingly, Andrew, did you watch the GCN interview of Jerome Swart, UAE's director of performance, where he was talking about now the UAE team does a pyramidal followed by a polarized?
Yes, yes, I did actually. It's funny
Yeah.
that you bring that up. Yeah,
I
it was
mean,
very interesting.
yeah. And, and then I think also it kind of goes into the way that, like, how I've known that pros train all along, because they do build their base with a lot of zone two, but when they're climbing and doing training camps, a lot of pyramidal style training. But then when they get into that race season, like everyone right now, if everyone did you watch the spring classics this past weekend?
No.
Okay, never mind. But we're coming into the beginning of the spring classic season. We had, you know, the old Het Volk, we had Kern Bussel's Kern, we got Strada Bianchi coming up, and Flanders and Milan San Remo. All those athletes, they've finished building their base. They're now switched into like a race and recover mode, which is that polarized style of training. So the point is, circle it all the way back. Don't just do the 16 weeks of sweet spot. Switch from base to race. Do an interval specific plan after that. We have mountain biking, road racing, criterium, time trial. If you're doing any event that has climbing in it, get on the climbing intervals plan. If you're doing gravel, switch straight over to the gravel plan that's got the gravel power workouts, the gravel simulations, the long rides in there. And that's kind of how we think about training load and composition and periodizing your annual training.
Yeah. One last thing I'll say before we go here, Frank, is in regards to the UAE performance director interview.
Hmm.
You sort of alluded to this point already, but it's a lot of like old ideas, just sort of reframed and reordered, right? Like a lot of the
Hmm.
stuff that's really hot right now, like the high torque stuff, like yeah, we're maybe tweaking our approaches to be even better over time, but like you've been doing that for probably freaking forever, right? Like like it's really
Yeah.
not new, and it's just basically the way that it goes is that everybody latches on to some crazy new concept because they think it's the hot new thing,
Hmm.
and then we just come back to the old stuff again. And it's not old stuff, it's just that there's only so many ways to train, right? Like nobody
Hmm.
I don't think is really reinventing the wheel. It's just yeah, doing putting it all together correctly. Like
Yeah.
each training concept is like a block, and then putting them all down in the right order is sort of where the magic happens. So
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, I think what you're saying is that we do that for you, and you don't really have to think that hard about it because you've in particular spent I don't know what 30 years figuring out the best approach, and so
Not that long, but close.
sure, yeah. Well, regardless, like yeah, just take the
Yeah.
thought out of it. I mean, you don't want to be like this is our jobs, right? We're
Yeah.
professional coaches. Like we just manage this stuff. That's literally all we do.
Hmm.
So like yeah, just you know, what's the word for it in business? Like delegate that to us for you.
That's right. Yeah.
You
Hit the
know,
easy button.
it,
We just spent like an hour nerding out. And like, if you're like vibing to this and you want to, but you don't want to figure it out, that's why you hire a coach. And because like Andrew will just talk with you, ask you tons of questions, and then just plan it all out for you. And it looks like it's just a training plan, but there's like all these layers of the onion that we've thought of, when we design that custom training plan for you. So you don't even have to like ask about it. It's like, this like everything that we say in this podcast goes into the way that we coach you.
right. And this is one podcast. Like to kind of explain everything would be many podcasts, and that's why we do this and still have stuff to talk about every week and month. You know,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
there's just a lot of nuance to it. So
Hmm.
yeah, I'm here for it.
I'm here for it. One other interesting tidbit from the Jerome Swart GCN interview. It was interesting. He was like saying, "Well, in the last 5 years," and I was like, "Man, we've been paying attention to training load for 20." And
I know.
and they were just. He was like, "Yeah, we've really changed the way we thought about training load." The only thing I heard different then was that they're tending towards longer mesocycles of like 5 weeks on,
Hmm.
1 week
Yeah.
off. I thought that
Right.
was interesting. It makes sense with pros. They can just, dig that big of a hole and then take a rest. But that was the other thing. And they were talking about, pyramidal training. I'm like, hello, 20 years,
Yeah.
it's
Well,
interesting. Yeah.
the thing that I was taking away from that whole interview is like, okay, yeah, like people are fueling well now. Of course they can stay on longer. They can do more. It just goes back to what we were saying like really early in this conversation, which is like fueling yourself well is a really good way of preventing yourself from getting cooked.
Hmm.
And with these top end athletes, like they can really kind of push the limits of that.
Hmm.
And so, before like 20 years ago, when they were like not eating anything, yeah, they probably couldn't stay on that long. You just couldn't do
Yeah.
that training. You would be cooked. So it's like
Yes.
the same guys, the same level of talent, but it's with new tools. And
Hmm.
they also talk about like the recovery monitoring, right? Like
Yeah.
if you really are smart about that, you're paying attention to sleep and HRV, you can also, afford to let's say, get away with more. And when I say get away with more, what I mean is like your plan can be smarter. And so
Yeah.
you can, in the long run, get to a higher training load.
Yes. Yes. That could be a future podcast. We really just break down that we could break down that interview and talk about how it applies to
Sure.
like
Yeah.
everyone's training. Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds cool.
Okay. Well, let's plan on it, everyone. Listeners, look for that to come up next. I No, and speaking of next podcasts, Coach Elliott has got a nutrition podcast. He's going to talk about using like we're going to get down to the nitty gritty, give you like a blueprint for nutrition for your long like gravel or like Leadville style race. And yeah, but that's pretty much it for us this week. Thanks a lot, Andrew, for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Yeah. Great to chat, Frank.
Yeah. So, listeners, if you liked what Andrew Jeanette said, head on over to fastcatcoaching.com. Go to hire a coach. You can learn more about Andrew. You can hire him. You can talk with Andrew about what kind of training loads you want to achieve, or really what goals you have. And Andrew will, design you a custom plan and monitor your data as you go along, and really help you reach your best.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say here is like, if you're not sure that one on one coaching is the right solution for you, just reach out to me anyway. We can have a consult. I can talk to you about your specific training, your specific goals.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, if it's a good fit, then we'll work together. And if not, then we won't. And we have other options. But
Yeah. Yeah, because FastCat, we give everyone two ways to get faster. So we have the CoachCat app where we can build you a custom plan. We will suck in all your data, including your wearable data for that recovery, and give you an optimized red green on a daily basis. And then it's after that, it's kind of like a do it yourself training. You are your own coach, but you have an AI coach to consult with you and answer your questions, going to analyze your data on a daily basis. But what we do, we have this new Call a Coach program where when you onboard and you set up your training plan, you can call us. We'll send you a link, and it's a formal 30-minute consultation. And you can talk with us about, okay, did I set up my training plan properly? Is it right for my goals? We can tell you how to edit it and revise it to fit into your schedule. And then really just give you that validation. Okay, you're on the right track. This is what we would have our one-on-one athletes do. And then you're off to the races, literally and figuratively. Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah. So check us out. It's all over on fastcatcoaching.com. And thanks so much for listening. We like nerding out about this, and, share it with your teammates and friends. And we'll see you back here next week. Maybe we'll see you on some of these group rides on Zwift. If you want to join, we'd love to host you. All right. Well, it's pitch black where Andrew's from, and it's getting dark here. So we're going to let everyone go. But thanks again for listening. You know what to do: work hard, ride fast, have fun. And as always, FTFP. Thanks for listening.